How much casting turnover can one movie have?
Can you shed some light on the current situation?
Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. It's time for yet another source material video. This is a library book, and all of you should support your local libraries because unlike the mega corporations launching streaming platforms and churning out slop as fast as the petroleum industry is churning out plastic that is impossible to recycle, libraries are not asking you for money. Deep Cuts by Holly Brickley is a contemporary romance book with a heavy focus on music. It also has a film adaptation which began filming earlier this year. I have had this on my radar ever since the much earlier announcement was made for Austin Butler and Saoirse Ronan to play the lead roles. Naturally, I responded to that news by logging into my library account and bookmarking Deep Cuts so that I could circle back to it and do a source material video because who wouldn't want to see Austin Butler and Saoirse Ronan in a romance movie? Baz Luhrmann's Elvis is one of my favorite films from one of my favorite filmmakers, and Saoirse Ronan is absolutely fabulous, and I would have really liked to see what she would bring to a contemporary romance. Also, as a whodunit girly, I must say that See How They Run is underrated, and Saoirse was very funny in that. However, if you have kept up with the newer discourse about the Deep Cuts film adaptation, you might be thinking to yourself, those are not the names I've heard for the lead roles. And that is correct. Thankfully, I didn't let my excitement over the initial casting overtake how I went about working my way through my video to-do list, or else I would have been saying all kinds of things in that source material video about how great Austin and Saoirse are. There definitely would have been a play on words in order to include a Saoirse on Falasteen cutaway to promote the Irish language.
And start to teach them the beautiful Irish language.
Due to alleged schedule conflicts, both Austin and Saoirse dropped out of the film and were replaced with Drew Starkey and Cailee Spaeny. Queer is my second favorite Luca Guadagnino film. It was actually quite underrated upon its release, if you ask me. I even went to a special screening of Queer where Luca Guadagnino and Daniel Craig did a conversation about the film afterwards. Also, Julia Roberts was there in person to introduce the film. I know, girl, I know. And as for Cailee Spaeny, well, Wake Up Dead Man is my third favorite Benoit Blanc whodunit, but nonetheless, they are both more than competent performers in their own rights, and hopefully their chemistry is highly chemical. We're presumably still far away from seeing a first trailer, but I would certainly hope that the vibes are vibing because, having read this book, we are meant to be all entangled in Percy and Joe the way that they are emotionally entangled with each other. First, let's talk a bit about the casting mayhem, the one that really made headlines and launched discourse. Sometime after the recast was announced for the two lead characters, Percy and Joe, they announced casting for the character of Zoe. Specifically, Odessa Azion was set to play this supporting lead character in the story. If you haven't read this book, an introductory overview of Zoe is that initially she is dating Joe, that's Drew Starkey's character, and both Zoe and Joe become friends with Percy, that's Cailee Spaeny's character. It doesn't take long, though, for Joe and Zoe to break up because Zoe has come to realize in her early 20s that she is not attracted to men. Initially, she had come out to Joe as bi, and he was fine with that, but the more that time went on, the more she came to realize that actually no, she's gay and doesn't want to be with men at all, non-platonically speaking. When you meet Zoe, she's already wanting the romantic relationship to end, but the breakup process is moving slowly because these two have known each other for a very long time, they genuinely care about each other, and she's worried about how he's going to handle not having her around anymore, as he's a wounded boy with a dead mother and an alcoholic father. You learn quite early in the book's timeline that Zoe already knows she's gay and wants to break up with Joe. Eventually, they do break up, and Zoe stays friends with both of them, although there are some years that go by where she's having limited to no contact with each of them, but by the end of the book, she has become friends with both of them again. Here's another detail about Zoe, though. Her last name is Gutierrez. A quote from the book reads, "Through the thin wood-paneled door, I could hear CNN. Hanging chads, Broward County, and Zoe's parents making coffee. Her mom was Jewish, but her dad was Mexican, and I had spotted a decorative crucifix in the living room. Zoe Gutierrez is Mexican Jewish. Odessa Azayan is Jewish, but not of any sort of Latin American heritage, Mexican or otherwise. Thus, it took little time for her casting announcement backlash to swell up, initially among social media users in the general audience. She listened to this feedback and posted the following on her Instagram story. "Thank you guys for bringing this to my attention. I agree with every single one of you. I'm so sorry that this happened. It is so important for me to let you in on how it all went down. I went in for Percy, but was offered Zoe instead and instantly said yes. I'm so pissed, y'all. I hadn't read the book and should have paid more attention to all aspects of Zoe before accepting. And now that I know what I know, F that. I'm out. I'd never take a role from someone else that's meant to do it. That should do it. That's not me. There are a plentitude of people more than capable of playing this role, and I am not one of them. I can't wait to see who it ends up being." If you would like my opinion on things, she did the right thing. I would also guess that if all she knew was a basic idea of the character's storyline and only her first name, it's not unreasonable for her to not know the full details of Zoe's identity, source material-wise, particularly if she hadn't read the book yet. If you're a working actor, you're probably constantly auditioning for things, and it's not necessarily a given that you're going to go ahead and read the entire book just to prep for yet another audition for something that you don't even know if you've booked, nor do you know how similar or dissimilar that adaptation is going to be compared to the source material. After you've booked the job, of course you can read the book and decide how much or how little you would like to use that source material in how you build your performance and characterization. I am not presuming to know every detail of what went on behind the scenes or what everyone's intentions were. I don't want to project any sort of parasocial assumptions onto people that I do not know. The main thing I know about Odessa is the trivia which I learned the first time I saw her in a lead role, which was in the 2022 Hellraiser, when I discovered that she is the daughter of Dolores from Grease 2. Of all the ways to Nepo baby, that is a good one.
We can't see each other anymore because, sort of got another man on my hands now.
Oh, right.
Shortly afterwards, there was an open letter to Hollywood published with over 100 Latino creatives condemning this casting incident as part of a larger pattern of being exclusionary towards Latin American talent and demanding better. The letter also acknowledged and commended Odessa for listening, reflecting, and deciding to exit the project and become an ally. However, because if there's one thing the internet will do, it is pile discourse on top of discourse. That was not the end of things, because following the publishing of this letter, there were additional think pieces being published complaining about the discussions of erasing Zoe's Mexican heritage and not talking about Zoe's Jewish heritage. Well, guess what? Guess what happened next? They announced the new casting for Zoe, and it was none other than Ariela Barer. Would you like to guess her parents' background? Mexican Jewish. Now, I was absolutely delighted when she was announced for the role, not merely for her background matching the character from the book, but because she was a co-writer and one of the stars of one of my favorite films of 2023, a political thriller called How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which is based on a book which is still on my TBR. This means that no matter how good or bad or anywhere in between this movie ends up being, whenever I review it, I get to remind people to go watch the absolute cinema that is How to Blow Up a Pipeline. She's also queer in real life, like Zoe, so she has plenty of insight to bring to playing the many nuances of Zoe truthfully. No matter how annoying Percy and Joe's situation is in Deep Cuts, if I can talk about this project and remind all of you to support your local library and watch How to Blow Up a Pipeline, it will all have been worth it. Actually, let's do a reading check-in before I tell you more about the book's plot. What's everyone reading right now? I have been circling back to All the President's Men by Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward because I watched the film adaptation and I had the time of my life watching Robert Redford investigate Watergate, so of course I wanted to read the book. I'm also continuing to work my way through Under the Axe of Fascism by Gaetano Salvemini, which is a history book about the rise of fascism in Italy, and I learned about that book because it was name-dropped in Black Shirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. It's a bit dry in its writing style, which is why I have been reading through it more slowly. I'm also going to start The Odyssey soon because I would like to do a read of that is closer to the release of Christopher Nolan's film adaptation. Like I said, let me know in the comments what it is that you're reading. Now, back to Deep Cuts. This film adaptation has Sean Durkin directing and writing the screenplay. For anyone unfamiliar, Sean Durkin's previous film that he wrote and directed was The Iron Claw. This was a biopic about the Von Erichs, who are a family of professional wrestlers. If you haven't seen that film, prepare to be emotionally devastated. It's a great film, but it's also the type of movie that you go see at the cinema and you can hear middle-aged men in the audience audibly sniffling because it's a story that is reaching into their deeply held, lifelong wounds from not being able to feel free to express the full range of human emotions. With that context in mind, and the fact that Deep Cuts has been tapped to be released by A24, this all tracks with the material itself. You read this book, and it's not at all giving fun and whimsical rom-com, which happens to be the particular flavor of romantic fiction I am demanding there be more of at the cinema, but Deep Cuts is the type of romance with all of the right ingredients, with its story, filmmaker, and studio backing, to end up being well reviewed by the critics and presumably be a modest success at the box office. Deep Cuts begins in 2000 and finishes up its story at the end of 2008. Initially, the story is set in Berkeley, but moves around to other cities as the years go by, including New York City, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Miami. The title, Deep Cuts, at surface level refers to the popularity of songs. Here is a quote from the book ruminating on this topic. Anyway, Tracy Chapman has more authenticity in her little finger than half the drivel Neil worships. So does Neutral Milk Hotel in a different way. Their songs simply can't qualify as deep cuts because of their popularity among a certain subset of collegiate, and this makes them automatically suspect to people like Neil. I personally like to pretend the phrase deep cut has a totally different meaning, one that has nothing to do with anyone else's opinion. How deep does it cut? How close to the bone? How long do you feel it? The story is told in the past tense in Percy's POV. Percy is actually her chosen name as a nickname of sorts from her middle name, which is Persephone, and her first name is actually Aileen. She meets Joe, who is an aspiring musician, aspiring as in he wants to do it professionally, and eventually he outright says that he doesn't believe he is capable of doing any other job well enough for that to be his primary career. He struggles academically. Zoe has often helped him to pass his classes by gesturing to give him answers to multiple choice tests and writing papers for him. Zoe and Joe have been together for ages, and it's to the point that he's not only close to her, but also to her parents. Even years down the line, once his band starts to gradually become more popular and get mainstream attention, he will still go and spend the holidays with Zoe's family. When we first meet Zoe, she is running Ring Finger, which is a zine that Percy writes a music column for. And there's only a few seconds of reading the book where you think that Percy having feelings for Joe and him seemingly having feelings for her too, is going to lead to some sort of unpleasant drama related to infidelity, but then Zoe does the big reveal when she privately tells Percy that she's gay, although she uses a different word at first. It's very early 2000s of her, if I do say so myself, since we did hear that word used in Legally Blonde. I'm not going to say that word, but you can take a guess. You'll probably know which word it is. Joe's parental trauma is highly formative to who he is as a person. When he pursues his career as a professional musician, he names the band Caroline, which is the name of his dead mother. He describes himself, albeit somewhat flippantly, as a poor blue-collar boy with a dead mother and an alcoholic father. This parental trauma is also why it takes longer than it should for him and Zoe to fully break up, and why he's so reluctant to start something non-platonic with Percy after that breakup. Zoe is absolutely my favorite character of this book, and I would probably like the story far more than I do if she had been the main character. She is political and feminist in a way that Percy remembers as being ahead of the times, those times being the 2000s. In general, the writing style is such that you're often breezing through the details of what has happened in Percy's life. You're mostly zooming in on the events that are more memorable to her and fleshing out the emotions of how she feels throughout these experiences. And of course, there's a heavy emphasis on music throughout. Percy is obsessed with music. She and Joe connect through music. And there's a point maybe about midway through the book where they explain how Music is a lens Percy sees the world through, and people and herself through. This is when Percy is in New York City pursuing her master's, her MFA, and in her writing workshop she presents something that she's written, which is, on the surface, about music. But it's also about men mistreating women and famous musicians writing songs about these entanglements with each other, but there's also a deeper context, a subtext, that comes from Percy having had really negative experiences with men. When she first tried to hook up with a man, it was very painful for her, it wasn't working, and she ended up running out. She also ended up circling back to that same man to try again because she wasn't doing well emotionally, psychologically. There was drama with Joe, like always, and she thinks that getting closure with this previous and her only terrible hookup will help things to resolve. It's not logical and it's kind of hard to explain in a summary like this. You can read the book though, of course, if you want all of the context. She also, while in New York, gets assaulted. Now, I'm not going to describe all of that in detail, but I will say that it was something that happened in public with loads of people around at some sort of bar where a bunch of them are present to see live music play. This piece that she writes for this writing workshop is heavily informed by these bad experiences with men. When her piece is shared and the other writers are giving feedback, most of them don't really understand what her piece is about because they don't have all of this context that the book readers do about what Percy has gone through and how passionate she is about music. Only one writer in the workshop seems to get it. His name is Raj, and he says, "I feel very clear on what she's writing about, actually, because she announces it in the last line. She's writing about herself. So I would vote for inserting more of herself, not less of herself. She's writing about people, really, how people use music to get clarity on themselves. It's clear to me that Percy's subject is not music. Music is just her channel to get at people. Channel's not the right word. Her medium. Not medium." He widens his eyes, annoyed at himself. Anyway, I thought it was devastating. Percy and Raj begin dating after this, but I want to rewind a bit so you have more of the lore of Percy and Joe. One of the ways that they really connect is not just their shared love of music, but Percy provides Joe feedback in his songwriting. This feedback is critical. She is his critic, but it's more than that. She will give him specific notes that he will apply to whichever of his songs he's showing her, and he will apply that feedback, change things accordingly. Sometimes it's a discussion first, but either way, the quality of her feedback is good enough that it brings them incredibly close. Moreover, after Joe and Zoe have broken up, Percy is ready to make a move. She already has Zoe's blessing. Zoe gave Percy her blessing before she and Joe had even fully broken up. Zoe told Percy that Percy is Joe's musical soulmate and that Percy is cute. However, when Joe comes over to see Percy after a show and she tries to finally make a move on him for the first time, he rejects her and says that she's too important to him as a critic who helps him with his music. This was so early on in the book, and this was where they lost me. If it's a romance story between a man and a woman, and that man embarrasses the woman, I will be rooting for her to dump him. Like a giant assortment of actually recyclable items. No plastic bottles, you can't recycle plastic, that's a lie from the petroleum industry. Joe embarrassed her, and she was understandably upset because the vibes were clearly vibing between them. They don't really talk things through effectively though, which is a recurring issue they have that spans years of this story, but they end up hanging out together again to watch the news cycle about 9/11. If you think that's me making a joke, no. That topic is surprisingly central to this story. When I realized how much this was going to keep coming up, I thought to myself, when this movie comes out, if it is a fairly faithful adaptation, I am assuming that social media is going to have loads to say. Presumably, a fair bit of that will be people saying, oh, well, this is just something you're doing for shock value, something to spark discourse. And then a bunch of people on the other side of the internet are going to go, well, actually, no, because this was already in the book. Here's what happens. Besides that, of course. That happens, and then Percy and Joe are spending the day together, watching the news. The feelings they have for one another are still there, but he won't let anything of note happen. But then he ends up writing a song about that day they spent together. She helps him quite a bit by giving feedback, which he does apply. The song ends up getting released as a second single years onward, performed on television. It becomes a topic of discourse in the media and online once the culture warriors latch onto it. There's so much more, but First, we need to circle back to Raj. Remember, we were talking about Raj and Percy beginning to date when she's in New York City pursuing her MFA. They are somewhat happy together, but she still has these unresolved feelings for Joe, as well as this trauma with men, so that does diminish the full potential of what her relationship with Raj could have been. Joe reaches out to say that he will be back in New York City because Caroline, this band he's in, has been booked for a wedding, and he wants her to come as his date, or his +1. She does say that she's seeing someone, but you can be someone's +1 at a wedding, regardless of whether or not you are a romantic couple, so it's fine, she will go. As soon as Joe opens the door to his hotel room, he pulls her inside, and you can probably guess what happens. They get intimate.
Intimate? Is that how old people say sex?
However, once they go to the wedding, Percy meets girls there that Joe has hooked up with, or maybe one of them is someone he's hooked up with and then the other one just appears to be also interested in Joe. Either way, it's a mess. It is messy. Percy is upset. She asks Joe how much he's been hooking up with other women. It's a lot, unsurprisingly. And before long, Percy and Joe have a fight. It doesn't matter that Joe told Percy that he loves her because he's still immature and annoying. She is too, but he was the first one to reject her all those years ago, so that's the way the pendulum swung. I'm on Percy's side, even when it's Percy versus Joe. Percy tells Joe that she wants to go home to Raj because he makes Percy feel good, whereas Joe makes her feel small and bitter. Again, I have to point out that this feels like more than reason enough to end things once and for all, but I'm apparently supposed to still root for them to be together and be happy when they finally do decide to give it a proper go at the end of the book. I don't care. Don't drag me into your toxicity. I never rewatch Jeux d'Enfant, but I remember it so well because of the psychic damage that movie did to me, which is why I have so little patience to spare for Percy and Joe in deep cuts. They might as well be screaming "Gap at each other for how not invested I am in their so-called love story. To be fair to Joe, since I am meant to be telling you what this book is about, he did say to Percy that he is more confident now and ready, which is why he finally made a move. He was always worried about messing it up with her, which is why he didn't pursue things initially. Okay, fair. Why are you making that move when other hookups of yours are in immediate vicinity of her? And if that weren't enough, when Percy starts to leave the wedding after she told Joe about how he made her feel small and bitter, she goes back to his hotel room because she wants to retrieve the burned CD he had made for her. And when she gets there, she can hear him through the door hooking up with another girl. They're not teenagers at this point. You don't have an excuse for this mean-spirited juvenile nonsense. And he knows Percy's there. He slides the CD under the door and throws her words back at her. So Percy breaks the CD and slides the shards back under the door before she leaves. I loathe them as a couple. We could have been following Zoe all this time.
Lesbian pudding?
Percy is so devastated by all of this that she ends up running back home to stay with her parents for a while. She and Raj break up over email. She does eventually go back to New York City because of the sunken cost fallacy. Thus, she cannot bring herself to quit her MFA. She pens an email to Zoe, tells her about everything, including that earlier assault that happened to her in public. Zoe gives her a pep talk, and they start talking again through emailing as well as IMing. They make up after a prior disagreement they had had years ago. Zoe gives Percy good advice to help her working on becoming more empowered and self-assured. It's not an instant transformation, but it helps her to begin working on going down a different path. Here's the thing. Even after that mess that happened with Joe and Percy at the wedding, him saying he loves her and wants to be with her, only to immediately sleep with another woman right after they have an argument. Joe emailed Percy to say that he's not sorry for hooking up with another girl and he still wants Percy to help him with his songwriting.
Put your ring back on, honey tits. You haven't had enough porridge this morning to talk like that.
But I'm supposed to be happy that Percy and Joe end up together at the end of the book? How about he ends up in a volcano? How about that? Rewrite the story, throw him away.
Should I block it? Yeah, I'ma block it.
Zoe gives Percy such great advice that Percy emails Joe back to tell him that she officially quits as his critic/songwriter. She will listen to his next album as a fan, like everyone else. Jump ahead to 2005, and Percy is reunited with Zoe in San Francisco. She has loads of debt from getting her MFA, so even though music is still her passion, she gets a job as a trendsetter specialist. She doesn't love it, but she does find a way to enjoy some parts of it over time. Music is still the main thing, though. It's everything. It's the heartbeat of this book. Every chapter of the book is a song title. Joe's band, Caroline, finally releases their next album. It took him a few years to finish because, as he admits to the press, it took a while because there was a girl. We and Percy know that that girl he's referring to is Percy. When she hears the first single off this album, there's a line in it that is directly lifted from Percy's blog. What you're telling me is he still can't write without her. He also only includes Percy as a special thanks in the album credits, even though she absolutely helped him co-write the song Bay Window. That's the title of the song about 9/11. She calls him to confront him about all of this, and this is the first time they've spoken out loud to each other since her I quit email. After that call, he has the lawyers draw up a contract to officially list her as a co-writer of Bay Window, and the band posts an announcement on their MySpace page about this update, and they also name drop her blog. Percy has looked up the critical feedback of the album, but she hasn't actually listened to any of it, except for the first single that was released, but at Zoe's advice, Percy reaches out to Joe to ask for a ticket to his sold-out LA show, and he has her name added to the guest list. She only wants to hear the song she co-wrote, Bay Window, and do you know what this insufferable, messy man does? Before singing the song, he calls out to Percy in the microphone. He asks if she's there, asks her to identify herself, and announces to the entire room that they wrote this song together, and the song is about her. Did I mention that Joe has a girlfriend at this point in the story? I want to temporarily gain superpowers so that I have the strength to throw him onto some other continent where he can no longer terrorize Percy, who needs to learn how to love herself, have some self-respect, get far away from this man and stay away. For your own health and well-being, of course. At this point, Percy decides that she wants to give music another go. So she responds to the emails of Luke Skinner, who is a former member of Caroline, and also Joe hates him. Sure, we're very emotionally mature over here. I mean, of all the people to try branching out with as a songwriter/producer, yikes. Anyway, all things considered, despite a rough start in the beginning of her time in the studio, it's a meaningful experience for her, although later on, once the album is eventually released, it's critically panned. Not because Percy lacks skills, it's ultimately Luke who simply doesn't have what it takes. Anyway, before the album is released though, she emails Joe to let him know that she helped produce Luke's album, and Joe doesn't respond. These are overgrown children. Percy ends up asking Zoe to talk to Joe since he's going to be spending the holidays with Zoe's family, yet again. Mess, nothing but mess. However, it's not the end for Percy's journey towards music, as she has a computer person help her to fold her blog into a website for herself as a writer in a multifaceted sense. And she ends up being reached out to by an indie front woman that she happens to already admire. This front woman asks Percy to help her punch up a few songs, and the two of them are very excited to be able to collaborate with another woman for the first time. Anyway, Percy ends up getting fired from her trendsetter intelligence specialist job, though it seems clear that the company was going to be going under soon anyway. Percy is fired for mouthing off to a finance bro who doesn't understand that rich people are not in touch with the masses, and that was very iconic behavior of her, actually. And in hindsight, that probably helps me to stay on her side even when she's contributing to the messiness of whatever this thing is between her and Joe. Hurt a finance bro's feelings.
Your work is puerile and underdramatized. You lack any sense of structure, character, or the Aristotelian unities.
On her final work trip, because yes, they ask her to do one last work trip before her job is finished, she's in New York City, and guess who she randomly runs into again? Joe, of course. I'm so tired. Existing is tiring. Why subject oneself to a man like this? They flirt, he's single now, he brings her to a bathroom where they make out, but it still somehow ends up being awkward and weird. However, communication has resumed between the two of them. Finally, we get to Thanksgiving at Zoe's house, with both Percy and Joe being there. It's late 2008, Obama has just been elected. Zoe just lost her job, and Percy still hasn't found a new one, even though it's been a month or two since her previous job ended. Zoe is going to be moving in with her girlfriend since things are going well in their relationship, but also as a way of saving money. Zoe and Percy had been roommates, and Percy is supportive of Zoe making this move and assures Zoe that she will figure something out. The trio of Percy, Joe, and Zoe hang out, but Zoe is quickly weirded out by the sexual tension of Joe and Percy, so she leaves them alone, and they immediately hook up. They agree to give their relationship a real go this time. They look at listings and are thinking of moving to Montana together to lease a house, be a couple, and resume writing songs together. Are you tired? Because I certainly am. Despite my exasperation with this couple, I will say that the quality of the writing of this book is much better than a lot of the other source material books I seem to be covering nowadays. You know, the things that prove to be the most populist among the social media ecosystems. Those books have a tendency to be overly simplistic and pedestrian in their writing styles, vocabulary, quite literally everything about how they structure their storytelling. Whether or not I recommend you read this book, Deep Cuts, that's really going to vary depending on which types of books you're interested in reading. I read source material because I like to study the adaptation process, and I also really love to promote libraries. Regardless of whether or not I enjoy source material books, though, I'm always going to learn something from examining how that book compares to the adaptation or adaptations. For Deep Cuts, it's so big on the interiority of Percy's experience through all of this that I would imagine the film will be done in such a way that it will be much easier to find a way of connecting and better empathizing with various characters in addition to Percy, because that's what great actors do. Drew Starkey was great in Queer. It's very common for characters in films to contain multitudes, and actors can infuse their performances with nuance and layers that you just intuitively connect to differently. With a book, it's so dependent on the words and how you put those words together. But by simply watching an actor, there's so much else in how they emote, how they speak and carry themselves. You can have a character say one thing, but their facial expressions and body language might be saying the exact opposite of the lines themselves. I'm ambivalent about whether or not to push you to read Deep Cuts, but I am going to take this reading experience as a much-needed reminder that I need to read How to Blow Up a Pipeline because I really enjoyed that film, and I've been wanting to read the source material book ever since I found out that there was a book. Congratulations to Ariela Barer for booking this job as Zoe. That's going to be my favorite character in this movie. I am making an assumption, but it is a reasonable one for me to make. Someone out there, please make actual rom-coms. Cast Austin Butler in one. Cast Saoirse Ronan in one. The people, the romance girlies. We want whimsy, we want fun, and we want banter.